Thank you for joining us here on Ask a Historian. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. And each week we invite you to send in your questions, your curiosities, and we'll have fun exploring the history of the city of Mississauga together. Well, joining me this week on Ask a Historian is Stephanie Meeuwse with the Museums of Mississauga. She is the museum's collection supervisor with the Museums of Mississauga, and I'm delighted that Stephanie had an opportunity to join us this week. In particular, you have a long association with museums, 21 years, and tied really to the story of Mississauga's history and the collection and the interpretation of that history. And of course, we're here today to talk about an anniversary, and that is of Benares Historic House, part of the Museums of Mississauga on Clarkson Road. And so, Stephanie, thank you for joining us. And want you to expand a little bit and explore that story of the anniversary of Benares.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you for having me on the show. So June 25th was the 25th anniversary of Benares. We opened in 1995. At the time we opened, 3 of the donors were alive: Barbara Larson, Dora Caro, and Jeff Sayers, and they were all in attendance, as well as Hazel McCallion, the mayor at the time, and Mark Marland, and actually our new city manager, Paul Mitchum. So they all attended the event. It was a great day. So of course we had planned to do something in June this year, which was changed obviously because of COVID. Rather than keep changing the date and trying to push it back, we've just decided we'll celebrate the 25th during the 26th anniversary. So next June, we're planning to have an event. So hopefully everyone can make it then. We'll keep you posted. So of course, the history is a lot longer than the 25th anniversary of museum. The house was built in 1835. Captain Harris bought it for his family in 1836. Was probably living there in 1837. So the house is really unique because 95% of the artifacts on display are original to the family. So a lot of museums have pieces that are of the time period, but we have such a rich history. So it's just one of the things that makes Benares really unique as a museum.
And you also had, and this is, it's going to tug on my heartstrings. And I think we've talked about this before, but honestly, I can't remember if we have or not. But there were archaeological digs that took place just prior to the museum opening on site. And I think you have, if I recall, you have some of those artifacts on display within the house itself. That was my first dabble in archaeology, actually. I was a student. I don't know, did I ever tell you that?
I think maybe you did. It rings a bell now that you mentioned that, yeah.
I can't say I excelled at it or if I found anything interesting, but nonetheless, I was a student working on that project. But that would have been, I guess, early 90s.
Yeah, I think it was 91, 92. There was 2 different digs. And actually, it was a rich find. There was something like 250,000 items, mostly from the outhouses.
Yes.
So there was really a lot of material. Yeah, so the history is fantastic because we've got like first person from the families, we've got their letters, we've got their items, then we have the archaeology evidence that backs the history. So I mean, it's really just like a dream site.
This is it from a history perspective. Thinking, the broad city itself, we have more on this family and more on this house than any other part of our history, really. I mean, you can walk into, it's almost a time capsule in a sense.
It absolutely is. Like, I mean, it's really just amazing. And luckily, I was really fortunate that when I started, I worked a lot with Barbara Larson, who was one of the donors. And so over the years, just working with her, she was really supportive of the museums and continued to donate. So I really feel like the house is like my own. The items are mine. These stories are now my stories. Like I just have invested so much time in it. So it is really nice. So sometimes when I give a tour, I think I just go on and on. They're like, when are you going to write a book about it? And I'm just like, I just, love it. It's just so interesting. I mean, we have their letters. We've got their underwear even. I mean, it's really hard. Whereas at Bradley, I love it as well, our sister site. But, really we only have a very few things from the Lewis Bradley. And so it's harder to have that connection with it. Whereas each thing at Benares, mostly, Barbara has told some, oh, I remember this, or my grandmother made this, or my aunt did this, so it's kind of, special.
So I'll follow up with the question and say, when are you going to write that book?
No, maybe when I retire.
There you go. But it just, for those that haven't visited the site, and even those who have but have not been a return visitor in some time, it's a remarkable site. It is walking in the footsteps of the past, and literally on the floor of the past. That was a recent uncovering of the original floor level, I believe. Is there a story behind the painted floor that was discovered?
Yeah, so actually we're really surprised. So part of my job, as well as looking after the artifacts, the houses are artifacts. So I'm involved in all these sort of maintenance projects. So when Barbara was 16, they put in little strip hardwood over the original floor. So we didn't really know what was there, but it was so thin, we couldn't really refinish it anymore. So we were really taking a chance to rip it up, but it was ripped up and we found the remains of this beautiful painted floor. So the house had originally burned down in 1855. So it was rebuilt in 1857. So this was the remnants of the 1857 floor. And then at different times it had linoleum and stuff put over it. So even like later generations didn't know that floor was still existed underneath. So it was pretty exciting. We had two conservators on site and they like hand painted all the spots that were really worn based on all the stuff around the edges of the floor because they weren't as worn. And she was literally just like on her hands and knees painting it in. You can, it's actually amazing because you can barely tell the difference. We try and maintain it and keep it up.
Yeah.
And then the main rooms, it showed evidence they were just bare wood. So they had some carpeting nailed down over top of that. So we've got a finish on it now. But so it's, you know, it's pretty, again, for a history geek like us, it was pretty exciting.
It's amazing from an artifact display perspective too, this idea that you're walking into, I mean, we all visit museums in time, and like I said, even with Bradley, you showcase kind of the life and times of the people based on the artifacts that have been collected to represent that time. The artifacts are in the house, are from the family, from the house. I mean, like that's what's so amazing about this property. It's their dinner, you know, it's their table, it's their chairs, it's their paintings, it's their player piano. It's
Yeah, no, actually the player piano did buy, and that's one reason we can use it. The family did have one, but there's a few things that are hands-on so that you can actually touch them, because of course it was the original, we couldn't play it. So that's one good exception, actually, I think.
and I think it just there are so many things. I've been in the house so many times, and the stories that have passed down, and yes, some of the ghost stories. We don't have to go into those today, but you know, that's an enticement for someone to come visit and wonder about those stories as well. But you know, the bread oven that's outside. I mean, so reflective of the life and times of not only our past. I mean, this property again dates back to, you know, the house to the 1850s, the property even earlier than that, but that successive generation story is quite amazing. And then here you're, you know, flash forward in time 25 years ago, through I guess through the Ontario Heritage Trust to the city of Mississauga, and maybe you can explain me that process as well. This becomes a museum, not only just the house itself, but the family treasures within the house become a museum. And here we are today. I mean, we have this amazing facility, this amazing entity within our city that we can celebrate and really call our own. How did the museum come to be in terms of from the family to the trust to the city of Mississauga?
Yeah, so Naomi Harris was the last owner from the family of the house. So she was the daughter of Arthur and Mary Harris. She never married, so she lived there her whole life. So she passed away in 1968, and she always hoped that the house would become a museum. So she did leave it to her nephew, Jeff Sayers, and then Dora Caro and Barbara Larson, her two nieces. So they had approached, it was the Ontario Heritage Foundation at the time, to acquire the property. And so they did take over the property, and it was actually the first one that they had acquired themselves. So it was pretty, I guess, new processes. And originally at the front of the property, some of the property was going to be lots that were going to be sold separately, but then they'd raised some money to buy that to have the complete section. So Ontario Heritage Trust actually owned the property, and Jeff Sayers lived in the house, because an empty house, of course, starts to go bad. Things go bad quickly. So he actually lived in there until into the 1980s. So I guess Ontario Heritage Trust you know, you do need to still raise a lot of funds to have a museum, and the whole house was retrofitted. So they did have the archaeology digs on site, and then I guess they went into negotiations with the city. So starting in 1994, there was all the, you know, there's different studies and stuff to see the feasibility. Work started to get it retrofitted, you know, with sprinklers and stuff, new HVAC. And then, yeah, it opened as a museum in 1995, but it didn't actually formally transfer to the city until 2000, even though we'd already been operating for 5 years. So, and there's actually quite an agreement with the house that protects the property and the building. So each time we're doing some maintenance or something on the house, we do have to check with them. So in one way, it's fantastic because, you know, it will always be into perpetuity. That, you know, the maintenance and everything will be kept up on it. The grounds, everything's going to be kept. That little, like you said, a little time capsule. So yeah, so it was pretty exciting. Now the family did keep a lot of artifacts themselves, but certain things, as they were dividing it up, they're like, this is like a key piece for Benares. We've got to have it here. The paintings, the clock, a number of those pieces. And then only one person in each generation is having children. So rather than everything being dispersed, those pieces that they had, then as the people are dying, are coming back into the collection. So with Barbara, like I was saying, we worked a lot together. Each year she would donate, you know, hundreds of items that she was worried about as she's getting older, her future, and like if her family would appreciate them. Not that they wouldn't, but they have a lot themselves, or if they're not into history. So she wanted to make sure they'd come back. So, which is great because again, instead of just some random, you know, here's a whole giant collection with no history, each time she's donating, she's giving us some information about it. So we get these real treasures.
The story doesn't stop.
No, yeah.
And you know, during these days of COVID, the museums normally have open hours and public can interact with, you know, incredible events and programs on the site. Of course, things are a little different today, but on the site is the visitor center, which has the kind of introduction to the property and introduction to the museums there. But how do people connect with Benares today? I mean, here we are, 25 years, and yes, we can't do the anniversary event, but it's still 25 years ago that it became a museum. How do they connect today in these different times that we're in?
Yeah. Well, actually, luckily, we are open up to the public now. So we're open for tours Thursday through Sunday through 12 to 4. You do have to make an appointment, which you can do by phone or on our website. So in one way, it's hard to be spontaneous when you got to make appointments because of COVID. But on the other hand, it's like you're having a private tour because it would only be your group. So it's kind of you're getting one-on-one special attention. So we do have that. We're trying our best. We've got actually 2 exhibitions that are on right now. One that's close to both our hearts, Matthew, is Our Boys, the Fallen Soldiers from Mississauga. And that's on display at Bradley Museum in the Anchorage. Again, you've got to make an appointment, but it will only be you who's in there. And it's a great story. It just tells all the stories of our fallen soldiers, obviously, but it's quite touching, and we've done our best to also make it uplifting. So I don't want it to be, you know, a downer, but it's quite good. And then
incredible.
Yeah. And then we have War Flowers on, and it's a traveling outreach exhibition. So it's not actually at our site, it's at the Living Arts Center. Again, you need an appointment. That's through the Living Arts Center box office. And by the way, admission is all free at the museums. It can be by donation. So yeah, both those are running. Our Boys runs until January, and War Flowers is till December 13th. So, you know, there is a way to get out of the house and come and do stuff. And then our great educational programming team have been trying to do some events with some online things, which are quite fun. I think we're all becoming so technologically savvy because we have to, you know, learn these things and how are ways that we can engage. So they're really active in that. For collections, we've been working on putting more of our collection online. We don't really have a lot of interaction stuff, but you can check back on that through the museums at Past Perfect, and we have a lot of our artifacts and research. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, they're like you said, we're all trying to be this, technology and evolve as we go. But again, that there's nothing like walking in the doors and walking in the footsteps of the past. And so, Benares is there. It is open. You can't just walk in. You have to pre-book, but well worth a visit. And reflect on 25 years in museum. Reflect on, I'm not good with math, but 170 plus years of history. And like I said, the artifacts, the images of the families, the stories of the families. Let's see where the anniversary event takes us next year on the 26th anniversary, but let's celebrate the 25 years that have been a fantastic addition to the Culture Crown in Mississauga. And so with that, Stephanie, thank you so much for your time, not only for this, but for 21 years of incredible, passionate service and dedication, I guess would be the better, to collecting those stories and interpreting those stories and making them, as you said, they feel part of you now, and perhaps better saying you're part of it. and,
Yes, maybe.
And just it's fascinating. You never know how people engage with it, but come see the tours, come hear the stories of the family, of the house, of the city of Mississauga surrounding it. And enjoy something that is unique to the city and is an incredible story of a family's history, but also part of the city's history. And so really, Stephanie, thank you for your time and for sharing your interest and your passion with us. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you, Matthew. I really appreciate it. We love working with Mississauga Heritage, so thank you. And hopefully we'll see a lot of people coming to visit the museum.
I hope so. And this is a good way. If we can't do the big 25th, well, let's at least do a hat tip to it, and we'll celebrate something next year when we're hopefully allowed to.
Yes, exactly. Thank you.
Our next question this week on Ask a Historian is from Amy, and asking about whether Terry Fox actually ran through Mississauga back in 1980. And thank you, Amy, for the question. And rather than give you simple yes or no, I thought I'd invite someone who was actually there and took a picture that really has become a time capsule of this very brief moment in our city's history. And welcome to Keith Moreau for joining us. And you were standing on that street on Lakeshore Road down in Clarkson back in July of 1980. And I'm wondering if you can kind of walk us through your memories and what brought you to that site, and what do you remember of the day?
Well, Janice and I both wanted to see Terry Fox if we could. So when we saw that his schedule was going to go through Mississauga, I think at that point we didn't know whether he'd be in Brampton at all. So we thought, well, we'll go down and see. And on the Lakeshore Road, where we saw Terry, there was an overpass of a rail line. And so we had to find a spot where I could still take a photo, and because there was such a crowd there. So a lot of people saw Terry coming through along Lakeshore. And when you see him on TV, you were always so proud of how much stamina he had and his desire to complete this. So that was very evident in his run through down in Mississauga. And when you get to see him eye to eye like that as he's passing by, and it's live, it's a whole lot better than just on TV. So we really were happy to have gone. So.
What do you remember from the emotion of the day? Because I've talked to a few people over time that, some people were in tears, other people were cheering and clapping, other people were joining in the run. What do you remember from the kind of the crowd and the ambiance of that moment?
Well, that's the thing. As we're standing around waiting for Terry to come along, eventually you hear a buzz happening further up the road. And you're thinking, okay, he's got to be coming now. Wow. And then as the buzz starts getting closer to us, then indeed you're starting to sort of be on extra excitement. And then we spotted him coming along the road. And so you're seeing him at a distance. And as he got closer, the crowd around us all got very involved in cheering out to Terry and waving. And there were people very emotional and everything. We were very happy to see him and happy to know that he was doing what he was doing for the cause. And
Well, we know it today. I mean, every year in the, around the end of September, we have the Terry Fox runs. Of course, this year is a little bit different with the with COVID and the I guess things are going virtual now with the Terry Fox run. We know it today as the Marathon of Hope, but at the time it was termed the Trans Canada Run in Aid of Cancer Research. So Marathon Hope was a Marathon of Hope was a little bit kind of more of an easier way of referring to this moment in time, but it really did unite people. I mean, we had there was a reception for him. Do you remember anything of the gathering? I don't know if you made it that far in your own kind of time down on Lakeshore Road there, but there's a little parquet at the corner where the dignitaries welcomed him. I think Mayor Hazel gave him a Mississauga memento to take with him on his route. Were you part of that crowd? I mean, that would have been something else too.
Yeah, I don't recall that part. I do recall after he went by, we had parked some distance away, and we thought, well, we better see if we can make our way back through the crowd to the car. But I don't know that we knew of the official ceremony being that close by or anything. So.
Right. Well, it was just, and we've talked to people over time where, again, people were overcome with emotion. That there were, whether it be jubilation or celebration or sadness of watching this young man struggle in his run. I guess I don't know how effortless it was, but we've certainly seen video have become an iconic Canadian symbol. But here you are in the midst of this crowd of taking in this moment of Canadian history, and it's probably even hard. It might be a question of reflection. You're able to look back on it now, but at that time, it was you're seeing this in real life. You said it was you watched him run by you. I mean, that had to just resonate with you all these years later, and you have a crystal clear memory of that specific minute or two of time.
Yeah, that's where I say that to see him in person was so much. I mean, it was iconic on TV, but to see him going by, we didn't cry, but we cheered because we were so proud of what this fellow Canadian was accomplishing.
And then you said that what brought you to Mississauga was not realizing that he might come to Brampton, and then a few weeks later you had a chance to see him again, I guess, in passing at least.
Yeah, when I found out that he was going to be going in the section of town that I was working in an advertising department at the time, when I thought he was going to be there, I said, can we do something for when he's out this way? And I did separate letters so that each person from the office could hold a different letter up, and it all spelled welcome Terry.
Yeah.
And so that was a further involvement that I had. Now, around before Terry was even running, I had been for a few years going to outdoor art shows in various parts of Ontario. So rather than just be at the art shows, I thought, well, maybe if I do an image of Terry. So I got permission, went ahead, drew in pen and ink, so little dots one at a time, and I arranged to have it printed. And I was going to the shows and selling it, I think it was for $5 or $10, that all the money went back. And so this is the image that I drew, and it was printed the same size as what you're seeing here. And so the lettering is all hand lettered, and Terry, like I say, was drawn in pen and ink. Wow. And so after he was in Brampton, and there wasn't going to be a whole lot more shows, I found out, I think the same day that he was going to be at the studios in Agincourt for the CTV. I think it was the same day I found out, and I said, well, I got all these posters left over. I'm going to go to Agincourt, see if they can do anything with them at that special podcast they had.
Yeah.
And so Harvey Kirk was there, Lloyd Robertson was there, and I was there, and I got to talk with Harvey, say what I had and what could they do. And they had a bunch of volunteers, I think it might have been Legion members, who went up into the crowd holding various amounts of the poster, and they got rid of all the rest of the posters for donations to the Terry Fox Fund.
Incredible, incredible.
Yeah.
Congratulations for you for connecting so positively with this moment in history, this moment in time. And Where were you? In Mississauga on July 13th of 1980, you were along Lakeshore Road.
Yeah.
And then about 10 days later, where were you in Brampton when you saw him again?
It was east. He ran eastward from say Dixie Road.
Yeah.
So I guess just after or just before Airport Road.
Okay.
Because the office is right at Torbram there.
Okay. Yep.
So it was out on the side of the highway where we had all the letters to spell welcome, Terry. And so I don't know where he would be heading, like it was back eastbounds, and I don't know how much more run he had that day, but it was nice to be part of that too. So.
And that was Highway 7, you said, right? Highway 7? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, not only did you see him once, but you saw him twice, and then had a third time to engage with the movement itself. And incredible story with this. And just so get back to our question from Amy earlier, was just about his run through Mississauga. So yes, indeed, he did come through Mississauga. There were many residents who remember the event, have talked about it. You took a picture of it, or at least 3 pictures that I know of, maybe more, but and just captured that moment. One of the fascinating things is there was a small reception held for him at the corner of what is Southdown Road and Lakeshore Road. Very brief. It was about 15 minutes in length, and then he was on his way. We have no pictures of that moment in time, and yet we have lots of news stories about it, and people have recorded some of the little speeches that were made and the presentations that were made, but we have no pictures of that moment. So his time in Mississauga, as far as we know at this moment, you are the only person who captured those images. So it's kind of a neat part of our history, and thank you for that. And again, it's stuck with you all these years, so I really appreciate you sharing that story with us, and connecting to what has become a national time each year of the Terry Fox Run, particularly with the school age kids. Of course, this year things being a little different and things being virtual, but remembering the fact that he did indeed cross our city. And albeit a short moment in time, but July 13th of 1980, Keith, you were there on the road, and you have the evidence to prove it. So thank you for this. Thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Well, you're more than welcome.
So this week on Ask a Historian, I'm very pleased to be joined by a longtime conspirator in local history, and a fellow of has worn many hats in its past, and most recently, I guess not most recently. Most recently is as a counselor for the city of Mississauga, but an author, a noted author and historian. We've had multiple books. The Apple Blossoms and Satellite Dishes, the story of Applewood Acres was your first calling out. From Frozen Ponds to Beehive Glory, the story of the Dixie Beehives, of course, the famed hockey team here in Mississauga, and then of particular interest to those of those little tidbits of local history of fascinating Fading History Volume 1 and Volume 2. So it is my pleasure to welcome Dave Cook, former City of Mississauga multiple term counselor at the City of Mississauga, author, historian, former race car driver, a newspaper, radio. I don't know, we can go on in that, Dave, but thank you for not only joining us here, but for your contributions and dedication to local history and exploring the story of this place. So thank you for joining us here on Ask a Historian.
Matthew, thank you for the invitation. I'm just delighted. I never ever hesitate taking the chance of talking about history here in Mississauga.
It's fascinating, no matter where you live. And I know we've talked about different places over time as well, but Mississauga's got a story that's unique and fascinating and should be explored. And one of our questions this week, and one of the reasons I reached out to you from your assembled material and Fading Histories, revolves around a fascinating little chapter in the story of Mississauga, part of a bigger story, of course, of Avro Canada and the Avro Arrow, but very specific to the flying saucer. And the question comes from Rob asking about the flying saucer that was made in Malton. And so just wondering if you can jump into that. I know you've written about it, and I couldn't think of a better person to ask about the famed, if short-lived, flying saucer of Mississauga?
Well, yeah, basically it was called the Avro car. And in June of 1952, Avro was playing and toying with the idea of a flying saucer, and that's having an aircraft that can literally take off instead of a runway, but take off from a standing and go straight up and then fly off. And the end of the story is they only got 8 feet in the air, and it wobbled too much, and they had to can the program. But then when they canned it, something else happened. But basically, the flying saucer had 3 jet engines and a big rotating fan in the center, and that was, of course, its elevation type thing. And it was $75 million. Now think about this. We're not talking 1952. $75 million the government spent developing this flying saucer. And it was developed and headed up by an engineer called John Frost, who later, in many years, went on to Australia. But in 1955, the Canadian government basically gave up the idea of a flying saucer, and the American government was fascinated with the concept. So they came up to Canada and made a deal, and we're looking at basically $100 million price tag that the Canadian government had put into it. So and rather than just scrap it and not have any money, they decided to accept the American offer. I don't have any actual confirmation of how much money, other than I'm told it was $2 million that the American government paid Canada, and they took over the project. And the interesting thing is, Matthew, they developed the project in Malton. They continued to there. And as a schoolboy, I remember vividly, I went to the Malton Public School, and I lived on the 6th line on a farm, which is basically about where Terminal 1 is now. That was where my dad's farm was. And I used to walk to school, and I would walk past the area, the buildings where they had the flying saucer, and I would see American guards, armed guards, patrolling, you know, U.S. Army and this type of thing.
Yeah.
Fascinating. My brother, he was an engineer with Avro, and so I asked him what's going on. And he told me about the flying saucer, and it just, I just couldn't resist writing about it.
Oh, it's a fascinating story, and it's such a strange vehicle, and we'll show some imagery here as we're talking of the flying saucer. But you know, a short-lived vehicle. Ultimately, as you said, it didn't work as anticipated. So it ultimately did. It didn't come off the assembly line, so to speak, if you will.
Well, you know, the concept basically was, if you think about it, during World War II, we had aircraft and we needed runways. Now, you could have an aircraft that could fly out of say a mountain tunnel, like a volcano tunnel type thing.
Yeah.
First of all, the enemy wouldn't be able to find the airport. They wouldn't be able to bomb it. Right. And we have a military aircraft that could fly up and fly away and defend us. So the thought and the idea was perfect, but it just didn't work.
The technology didn't meet up with the idea, I guess, in that sense. You alluded. Sorry, Dave. Go on.
I was going to say, today with the computer that we've got, computer world, I'm sure they could develop something that would stop the saucer from wobbling and make it fly.
I'm sure they could. And they probably have. We just don't know about it. You alluded to in part of your early question about the cancellation led to something else. And given its association with Avro Canada, and wondering if you can allude as to what that something else might have been.
With respect, well, of course, at the same time, they were developing the Avro Arrow.
Yes. And
that was primarily something else, that they had to put the money toward that. And that is a long story, but basically, if you look at what happened, and let's first of all explain how we came to start to develop the Avro Arrow. Let's go back during World War II in England. They built a machine called the Lancaster bomber. And they were being bombed every day, as you know. I mean, the Germans and the enemies could come over and bomb London. So the Canadian government agreed with the British government that we would develop the Lancaster bomber here in Canada. And we ended up building over 400 of them in Malton, and flew them over to England and went into the war there. So because we couldn't be bombed, I mean, there was no danger really of us being bombed by the Germans at that point. So we built the Lancaster bomber, and what they said, the people from AV Row and Manchester, England, and the Lancaster people said that the Canadian Lancaster was the finest aircraft ever built. We built it a little bit differently than how the Brits did it in terms of the engineering. It looked exactly the same and it flew the same, but it was much better built. And they were impressed. And in, 2 years before the end of the war, they actually came over here and visited our company here called Victory Aircraft, which was a Canadian government crown corporation developing the aircraft. And they were just totally impressed. At the end of the war, everything, of course, stopped. But they wanted to come back, and they ended up coming back and making a deal with the Canadian government to create a company called AV Row Canada and develop aircraft here. And of course, the first aircraft, one of the first major ones, was the CF-100.
Yeah.
And that was a $102 million project, the CF-100. And,
that's in 1952 dollars. So
that's right. That's right. People have to remember that because that's going to be critical to the end of the story.
Yep.
As we went on, they built during the CF-100 development, they started on a thing called the C-102. And the C-102 was not a military aircraft. It was in fact the very first passenger jet airliner. And at the same time, their parent company in England was building the Comet. And the Comet and the C-102 were almost identical, but there were some engineering differences. As an example, the English one, they couldn't keep windows in the passenger windows would keep popping out because of the pressures. But the Canadians developed a different type of window and there was no problem. So when it came time to make the announcement that we have a passenger jet airliner ready to go, the Brits said to the Canadian division, hold off, we'll announce ours first. 13 days after we announced ours. But anyway, the C-102, again, it became very popular. And Howard Hughes, the American, got a hold of it for a month. He was considering buying it. And eventually it came back to Canada and the Canadian government stopped the program because it was too expensive.
Right.
Again, we were getting back into money. And then they started to develop the CF-105, the Avro Arrow. And that is a story and a half. It's filled with a lot of myths about how and why it was canceled and so forth. And people to this day, 62 years later, are talking about it. Yep. Can you imagine anything in our country 62 years later that you can walk down the street and the average person of middle age would know about the Avro Arrow? It's incredible.
I've always said, and I believe this wholeheartedly, if you ever stuck for a conversation with anyone, there are two subjects you can bring up because everybody's got an opinion. Either ghosts or the Avro Arrow. Everyone has an opinion. So I mean, Dave, I'll maybe open this up as an invitation to a future episode as we can look at the Avro Arrow, and maybe we'll have some questions on the Avro Arrow. I'd love to discuss the topic a little bit greater on, but you flash forward through the building of the aircraft, the science behind it, and the amazing, I guess the specifications of what it could perform to. But the cancellation itself, I mean, we have, we go back to our original question, the flying saucer got canceled, the C-102 jetliner gets canceled, and then we have the CF-105, which defied all expectations and was an incredible aircraft, and it too gets canceled. And I wonder if you want to maybe we'll whet the appetite of the audience a bit and see if we can get some questions, but talk about the cancellation and the impact of the cancellation.
All right, well, let's go back first of all to explain to those that might not realize that the Avro Arrow, to this day, its performance ranks at 5th among all manned aircraft ever made. And we're talking 62 years ago.
That's incredible.
And we're at 5th. You can Google it. I did it last year and it came up at 5th in its performance. And the Avro Arrow was just incredible in terms of its performance. It just outnumbered everything in the world. Now let's talk. I didn't get political in my books because it's a subject that when I did the research, I am interpreting that research into what I'm about to tell you. I didn't. Book was strictly just what the aircraft was. But when you look at what was happening, Prime Minister Saint Laurent was encouraged by the RCAF to can the program because it was too expensive. And they felt that they could buy the American Beaumark missile, and that would do pretty much what we need for pennies compared to the dollars that we're spending on the Arrow.
Yep.
And so Prime Minister Saint Laurent was thinking about it. What he did, we find out later on, was he established a committee that toured the world to see if they could find any interest in the countries to buy the Avro Arrow, because it was so expensive here, we had to get money back. Virtually every country said there is no future in manned aircraft, the future is in missiles, the future of defense. So Saint Laurent is faced with this concept of, here we have this very expensive aircraft developing and no possibility of getting any money back. The budget of the aircraft, and this is well documented in the Toronto Star headline, I've got the papers, the budget hit 1/7 of the total Canadian government's budget.
Yep.
1/7, with no concept or no ability to recover any of that money. So Prime Minister Saint Laurent was about ready to can it. And here's where, being a retired politician, I would sort of understand the process. No politician is going to can a program and lay 30,000 people off work 6 months before the re-election.
Right.
Okay. That is critical. So Prime Minister Saint Laurent said, wait until after the election, we will do something. Well, he didn't get elected.
Right.
He didn't get re-elected. Diefenbaker did. He came in, he saw all of the reports and the whole thing. What choice did he have? And he canceled it. Now, a lot of people are saying, yeah, but why did we destroy it? Good question. If you look even to this day, there is a law, the Canadian government has a law that any military item under development that has not reached its final sort of release must be destroyed if the program is canceled. So that's why the Arrow was canceled, all ripped up and torn apart.
Yeah. Well, I think that's part of the important part of the story from the Avro Arrow, and I know we're deviating a bit away from the question, but it's down the rabbit hole a bit in a way. You open the door to the Arrow, and it always sneaks back in. But the plane never reached its final stage. It was a prototype. There were 5 produced and flown. They were all slightly different. It's a remarkable story. I mean, it was on the verge of production, and that can be tied into just that transition of governments, as you mentioned. But the sheer enormity of cost is not something to be discounted when looking back on the story of the Avro Arrow. It is remarkable. It's a sad story ultimately, though. I think you'd agree with that from the national pride perspective. And you grew up in Malton. You would have been tied to this story, even like. What did you experience as a child growing up in Malton during this time?
Well, every time it flew over our house, we knew it. My brother didn't talk too much about it. A lot of it was, secretive, this type of thing. My brother was one of the engineers with Orenda.
Yeah.
And he didn't say too much other than the fact he worked on jet engines, and but we knew about the Avro Arrow because we could see it when it took off, and we knew a little bit about it. But we didn't know a lot of details at that time until quite late when it became to the point where it was being canceled. That's when a lot of the information came out. But during the period of time, everybody in Malton knew that there was this incredible aircraft, but we didn't have any idea how incredible it was. It was just a big, huge, noisy aircraft. But it was quite something,
Now, as you're, I know the answer to this because I walk the same kind of footsteps, if you will, that you do in local history. But how many people have you met over the years that worked for Avro Arrow, were affected by the layoffs? I mean, can you even count that number?
Well, listen, you attended the meeting we had, I think, in February. I think it was last year.
Yeah.
And the room was filled with people who worked at Avro. Yeah. just incredible. I mean, they're out there, they're all over the place. And it's hard to find somebody who, if they didn't work there, they might know somebody who worked there.
Yeah. I was going to draw attention to, I saw you with a cup of coffee there or something, but 62 years ago, and yet here we have the Avro Arrow coffee mug. The story doesn't go away, and that's, you know, that's a tribute to how amazing of a feat of engineering this was, how tied it was to the community, and just that myth that has evolved around the story of the aircraft, for lack of the legend, if you will.
Well, you know, it's something that I'm amazed. As you know, Matthew, we're into this virus situation now, and there's no book signings. But I used to do 2 book signings a week on a weekend, all over Ontario, where I would literally rent a table at an auditorium at the nostalgia show, the collectible show, a military show, and so forth. About 100 vendors, and I was basically the only one with any information or books on the Avro Arrow. And people would pass my desk and look at it, and I sold a lot of books because people remembered the Avro Arrow.
Right.
They would, oh my God, and they would say, "Oh, that damn Diefenbaker." You know, they had really no concept of really what happened. But you know, the thing is, I was just amazed at how many people. I would say 1 in 10 would say, "What is that aircraft?" 9 in 10 would say, "Oh, the Arrow."
Yeah.
Yeah.
And be honest, it's something that has passed down through the generations. You were mentioning, you know, the middle-aged group that kind of remembers this, and I would argue that this is one of those stories of local history that has passed the generation mark. It has been passed down as a story, and even if younger people today don't know what it was, or you know, the term the Arrow or the Avro Arrow is known. There's a school in Malton that has a junior school in Malton, an elementary school, that has just renamed themselves the Arrows after the Avro Arrow. I mean, this is a junior school that was voted on by the kids of the school. I mean, you go to Malton today, the Welcome to Malton signs show a picture of the Avro Arrow. I always say perhaps we got it wrong. The CF-100 was and the Lancaster were the bread and butter of Malton, but it's the Arrow that has made the sign. It's
so true. That really is true. And of course, I think we all know that there's going to be an exact scale replica in the next 2 years, mounted on a pedestal up in Malton. Thank you to Councillor Carolyn Parrish for doing that.
Yeah, and again, we should make that there'll be more news coming. But you had your hand in the beginning of that project as well.
Well, the funny story there is that when I retired from council the first time in 1988, and around the mid-90s, I went back up to see a couple of the people at City Hall to get some information, and I was sitting in the office of the Commissioner of Parks and Recreation, and I mentioned to him, "Why can't you guys build an Avro Arrow replica and mount it up in Malton?" And Paul said, "Well, of course the cost is prohibitive, you know." So that was that, but it's always been my dream. What happened was when my reappointment to City Council the last time, my last week or so, I got a phone call from the people. Claude Sherwood, who was at that meeting in February. Yeah. Claude Sherwood and his group built an exact scale replica of the Avro Arrow, but it was not designed to be outdoors, it's strictly in the interior type thing. And we got a phone call, and they were asking if the city of Mississauga might want to buy it. And I jumped at the chance, and I called a meeting with everybody, all the senior staff, and Councillor Parrish, of course, because she's in Malton, representing that area. And when they arrived, and this is the funny story, when they arrived, walked into my office, they said, "I'm sorry to tell you this, but as we pulled into the parking lot, got a phone call, the replica has been promised by our club president to the Edenvale Airport. So there's not much point in having the meeting." Well, Carolyn Parrish said, "To hell," and she bangs it out, "We'll build our own."
And so we will. Incredible. It is incredible, and perhaps in time we can have the flying saucer come back too. I mean, that'd be kind of a fun addition to local law.
Maybe, you know, if we can live long enough to do that. But I think her next project would like to be the Lancaster bomber.
We need a bigger park then.
We'll get it.
Well, thank you for that informative answer. And not to cut short on this, but we actually have a second question this week. I'd like to touch base with you on that one if we could. Also tying back into your publications, your books that you've published in the past. And this question comes from Jürgen and asking about Second World War pilots trained in Malton, and is it true? I can say yes, it's true, but for a more in-depth answer, Dave, I turn to you, and wondering if you can explore that topic with us.
There were several pilots on the CF-105 Avro Arrow, but the most famous one, who didn't fly as many hours as the others, was Jan Zarakowski, and I think that's who maybe he's asking.
Yeah, but also the British Commonwealth plan that was up in Malton as well.
Yeah, during World War II, the Canadian government had 231, I think it was, over 230 military bases in Canada where they were training and teaching people for preparation for the World War II to go over and fight. Malton was base number 1, where they taught the first 50 hours of flying time. Okay, and from there, after that, the pilots then would go on to other airports. There was one at Harewood Acres. There was one, well, there was 230 of them, but they would teach very specific. They would teach bombing. They would teach radar. They, that type of thing.
Right.
That was called the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. So maybe that's the question he was asking about.
Yes, I think so, yes.
I thought maybe he was asking about Jan Zarakowski.
We can go into both, but what can you tell us about? Let's start with the Commonwealth Air Training Plan. Do you mind jumping into that a little bit, just to give me some background on that?
Well, it's in my book, and I've done a lot of research on it, and it's quite well known and publicized in terms of what it was. But basically, it was the Canadian government's effort in training troops to prepare them to go off to war during World War II. And there was all sorts of training going on. It was just incredible. Malton, of course, was site number 1. And actually, they also had navigation at Malton too. So,
I could say we'll do a plug on Fading History Volume 1. The very first chapter is on the Commonwealth Air Training Plan. So, but yes, indeed, just for a short answer to the question, yes, pilots were trained here in Mississauga, but as you said, elsewhere as well, over 230 sites associated with the Air Training Plan. But it is a fascinating story of kind of that war effort of kind of the what happens abroad beyond mainland Britain in terms of the Commonwealth support for the war effort overseas. And that is, we were supplying pilots, but we were also supplying the bases in which pilots were trained. And it's just a fascinating part of our story. And of course, to hybrid into the other, because I hadn't thought of that as well, but associated with the Avro Arrow, we had a number of pilots that had served in the Second World War that continued on with the testing of the Avro Arrow. Jan Zarakowski, Spud Pataki being some notable ones in that. Do you want to talk about Jan at all? And
Jan is, of course, I married a girl from Poland, so I have to boast about the Polish people. Jan Zarakowski, born in Poland. Now, Jan, interestingly enough, during the war, he joined the British Air Force, and he flew for the Brits during World War II. After the war, he came to Canada and was scooped up by Avro, Lancaster people from Avro and this type of thing. And Jan became a test pilot with the CF-100 and then transferred into the CF-105 Avro Arrow. The interesting story here is that Jan Zarakowski was the only pilot who was not licensed.
Really?
He did not have a pilot's license. And but
no one checked the resume.
but he didn't need it to fly the CF-105,
Right.
If you go to Barry's Bay, Ontario, I've got to show you here. I guess I'm so convinced about the Avro Arrow being, something. I don't know that you can see my cell phone.
Yeah.
There's the Avro Arrow on my homepage. That is a small 25% scale replica of the Avro Arrow in Barry's Bay, Ontario.
Yes.
An hour outside of Ottawa. because it's in Barry's Bay, because that was where Jan Zarakowski's family is now. That's where he retired. That's where he had his cottage and the whole thing. And the funny story about that, and I remember a chap telling me who flew a CF-100 alongside the CF-105 when they went out flying, and Jan flew over Barry's Bay and looked down and started to curse and swear, and the CF-100 pilot said, "What's the problem?" He said, "Somebody has got my boat."
Well, and that is one of those neat parts about where the Avro Arrow peeks through. I mean, you have the you have the 25% scale model of the Arrow at Barry's Bay. I mean, here we are looking. You've got the full scale replica that's now at the Eganville Airport, but we're looking to build our own here in Mississauga. Again, the story doesn't go away. It's a fascinating one, and Jan is tied into that. In Mississauga, up in Ward 5, you'll find Jan's Trail, which is named a recreational trail named after Jan Zarakowski. There's no shortage. I mean, your books are phenomenal, but as you know, there is no shortage of published material on the story of the Avro Arrow, and also tying into some of those other things that we talked about, whether it be the flying saucer or the CF-100 and the other. But there's no shortage of material on the Avro Arrow. It's a story that truly doesn't go away.
Well, you know, I'll tell you a funny little story here about business. When I was doing research in my book, and I wanted to get pictures, of course, from my book, and I called up Lou Wise. I knew of him. I didn't know him personally, but I got to know him. Lou was the chief photographer for the company. The Avro company employed 25 photographers full-time during its production. And their job was to take pictures and keep it sent out to the media after to get the generation of the interest. And the funny thing is, I said, "What about copyright?" And Lou said, "There is no copyright." He said, photographers would take a roll of pictures and send the roll to the news media. He said, "There is no way any photographer can identify that he took that picture, and he has no copyright on it."
Right.
I said, "Fine, so I can use them in my book." And he said, "As many as you want." So I've got a lot of pictures of it in the book.
No, you have some fantastic pictures, and again, I'll do the shameless plug a little bit later on, but or one more time, anyways. But well worth exploring local history, and Dave, you've done an exceptional job, and thank you for this. And I'll have you, if you're willing, and I haven't scared you away, I'll have you back on, and we'll delve into maybe some more Arrow topics and maybe some other things that come up as well.
Matthew, I'll make you a deal. Anybody wants to buy Fading History Volume 1, the Avro Arrow and the Flying Saucer and the Lancaster, send me an email, but copy you.
Okay.
Heritage Mississauga, so that you know that somebody has requested to purchase it. And for every purchase I make, I will give Heritage Mississauga $5.
Oh, you're generous. So we'll post your email here just so people can get in touch with you. But just to confirm from an email perspective here, we have email is cook.dave@rogers.com. cook.dave@rogers.com. And Dave, thank you for that. And let's see what we can do, not only in terms of book sales, but in terms of future questions as well. And we'll do a follow-up one. I'm dying to talk about Buffalo Bill Cody, but we can do that. We can do that later down the road, maybe. I like dropping little hints if people ask me some questions here. But
there's two very famous people that lived in Mississauga. One lived in Applewood Acres. He died in 1980, I believe, but he wore a white coat, little bit.
Yeah.
Loved chickens. Colonel Harlan Sanders lived in Applewood Acres, but the other one lived on Camilla Road. The last Grand Duchess of Russia, Romanov.
Yep. Maybe we can explore those later on too. I always say this is a question-driven show, so we look for the people we look for listeners to send in questions, and let's have some fun exploring them and see where we go from there.
And if I can't answer the questions, I refer them to Matthew Wilkinson.
And I do likewise, so we're good. Well, Dave, thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to future opportunities to chat and wander down local history road with you.
My pleasure, and thank you very much.
Thank you, William, for your question about the British Lord. Yes, Lisgar was, although it's a name of what we call a lost village here in Mississauga, a place that was that once existed around the intersection of what is now Winston Churchill Boulevard and Dairy Road West. Lisgar is a name that has really, for the most part, disappeared from the modern landscape, although it has made some inroads in the past years, remembering the origin of the name itself here in historic Mississauga, again associated with the lost village of Lisgar, at one point known as Switzer's Corners. The name Lisgar became official when the post office opened in 1871 at Switzer's Corners. Again, Switzer's Corners was kind of a crossroads hamlet around Winston Churchill Boulevard and Dairy Road. The postmaster who suggested the name was Samuel Alexander, a local resident. This is again in 1871. The name Lisgar was chosen in honor of John Young, the first Baron of Lisgar, who served as the second Governor General of Canada between 1869 and 1872. So in 1871, when the post office opened and the name was christened, he was the Governor General of Canada. One of the few reminders of the historic hamlet of Lisgar on our modern landscape are the historic Eden Cemetery located at the corner of Dairy Road West and Shelter Bay Road. And currently you can find the name Lisgar both in terms of a park and a GO station, as well as a modern subdivision area and a residence association, all carry the name of Lisgar today, but they are kind of rebirths, if you will, of the historic name. In terms of the name itself, the Right Honorable John Young, 1st Baron Lisgar, who lived between 1807 and 1876, was a British diplomat and politician. He served as the 2nd Governor General of Canada between 1869 and 72, the 12th Governor of New South Wales, and the Chief Secretary for Ireland between 1853 and 1855. From 1848 to 1870, he was known as Sir John Young, 2nd Baronet. He has he's a wealthy British politician, had a very short time here in Canada. He was educated at Eton and Corpus Christi College in Oxford, graduated in 1829, was called to the bar as a lawyer in 1834, Member of Parliament in 1831, and held that position for 24 years. 1841 as the Lord of the Treasury under Sir Robert Peel. There's another local connection in terms of the region of Peel. Secretary of the Treasury in 1844 and Chief Secretary of Ireland between 1852 and 55. He assumed the office of Governor General of Canada in 1868, but did not officially take up position here until his arrival and swearing in Canada on February 2nd of 1869. At the end of his term in 1872, he returned to Ireland, where he retired, and he passed away in 1876 at Lisgar House, also known as Castle House in County Cavan in Ireland. So there you go, a little brief history of the name of Lisgar on our landscape, although many of its modern associations are kind of a rebirth or reuse of that historic name. The name itself as a place name reference on our landscape dates back to the post office opening here in 1871. So thank you so much for your question, and hope you have some fun exploring local history.